Sometimes the most broken souls recognize each other across the vastness of forgotten places. In a world that throws away what it doesn't understand, one man's compassion becomes another's second chance. On the dusty outskirts of Sagebrush Flats, a weathered cowboy named Jed Crow finds a mare penned up with a cruel sign. Too wild. The townsfolk call her barren and dangerous, not worth the trouble. But Jed sees something different in her eyes, sorrow and desperate longing. When he buys her for almost nothing, Jed discovers two frightened foals hiding in the hills. They're her babies, taken from her and left to survive alone. Against everyone's warnings, Jed brings the small family together at his quiet homestead. But word travels fast in small towns, and soon powerful men come calling to claim what they think belongs to them. What happens when a man who has lost everything finally finds something worth protecting? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound journal sat open on Jed Crow's kitchen table, its yellowed pages filled with his father's careful script. A horse knows when you're listening with your heart. Read one of the many entries Thomas Crow had penned decades earlier. They can smell fear, but they can also smell love. Give them the second, and they'll follow you anywhere. Jed traced the familiar words with a weathered finger, the morning coffee growing cold beside him. At 58, he'd read these passages countless times, but they felt different now, less like distant wisdom and more like a map to somewhere he'd lost track of finding. The empty house stretched around him, filled with the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest until breathing became a conscious effort. 3 years had passed since Sarah's funeral. 3 years of sunrise coffee drunk alone, of conversations held with the ghost of her laughter, of looking across the breakfast table at an empty chair that still held the faint impression of her presence. The modest homestead that had once buzzed with plans for the future, talk of expanding the horse training operation, maybe taking in a few rescue animals, now felt more like a monument to abandoned dreams. The truck's engine turned over with its usual reluctant growl as Jed made his weekly trip to Sagebrush Flats for supplies. The 20-mile drive gave him time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse these days. The high desert landscape rolled past his windows in familiar waves of sage and scrub, punctuated by the occasional antelope that would freeze at the sound of his approach before bounding away in graceful arcs. Sagebrush Flats had seen better days. Main Street wore the tired look of a town slowly emptying itself out, one family at a time. The old movie theater's marquee hung crooked, advertising a picture that had stopped showing 2 months ago. Peterson's Feed and Hardware kept bankers' hours now, instead of staying open until dark like it used to. Even Martha Henley's general store, which had been the heart of the community for as long as anyone could remember, felt smaller somehow, its shelves not quite as full, its customers fewer and more hurried. "Morning, Jed," Martha called from behind the counter as the bell above the door announced his arrival. At 62, she still moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent 4 decades making sure her neighbors had what they needed. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for 20 years, but her eyes held the kind of warmth that made people linger longer than necessary when picking up their mail. "Martha," Jed nodded, grabbing a basket from the stack by the door. The familiar rhythm of shopping flour, coffee, canned goods, the basic necessities of a man living alone, usually soothed him. Today it felt hollow. "How you holding up out there?" Martha's question carried the weight of genuine concern. She'd known Sarah since they were girls, had been one of the few people brave enough to check on Jed regularly in those dark months after the funeral. "Getting by," Jed replied, the standard answer that meant everything and nothing. He paused at the magazine rack, pretending to study the farming journals, while gathering courage for the question that had been nagging at him. "You hear anything about old Ben Cartwright's operation lately?" Martha's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that might go unnoticed by someone who hadn't known her for 30 years. "Why do you ask?" Drove past his place yesterday, saw something that didn't sit right with me. The bell above the door chimed again as Doc Peterson shuffled in, his medical bag in one hand and a thermos of what everyone knew was black coffee spiked with bourbon in the other. At 71, Doc had earned the right to take the edge off his mornings, especially since he spent most of them dealing with ranch injuries and the occasional emergency that came with living so far from any real hospital. "Jed, Martha," Doc nodded, his keen eyes taking in their expressions. "You two look like you're discussing something weightier than the weather." "Jed was asking about Cartwright's place," Martha said carefully. Doc's jaw tightened. "That son of a—" He caught himself, glancing apologetically at Martha. "That man's been pushing boundaries for months now. Sheriff Morrison won't touch him, too much influence with the county commissioners." "What'd you see?" Jed hesitated. He'd learned long ago that in small towns, words traveled faster than wildfire and could be just as destructive. But the image from yesterday wouldn't leave him alone. A beautiful bay mare penned up in a makeshift corral, barely large enough for her to turn around. A crude wooden sign nailed to the fence post that read, "Too Wild," in harsh red letters. "Mare," Jed said simply, "penned up tight. Looked like she hadn't been fed proper in days." Doc and Martha exchanged glances. "Cartwright's been claiming he's got problem horses," Doc said slowly. "Says they're dangerous, unpredictable. Been trying to sell them off cheap or—" He stopped himself. "Or what?" Jed pressed. "Or have them put down," Martha finished quietly. "Claims it's a public service, getting rid of horses that might hurt someone." The coffee in Jed's stomach turned sour. He thought of his father's journal, of all those patient entries about understanding horses, about seeing past their fear to the heart of who they were. Thomas Crow had never met a horse he couldn't gentle, not because he was stronger or smarter than other men, but because he listened with something deeper than his ears. "This mare," Jed said. "She didn't look wild. She looked—" He struggled for the right word. "Broken." Doc nodded grimly. "That's Cartwright's specialty. Break their spirit first, then claim they're dangerous. Makes it easier to justify whatever he does next." The three stood in uncomfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up, sending a tumble of dust devils dancing down Main Street. The town felt fragile in moments like this, as if one strong gust might blow away what little remained of the community they'd all grown up in. "You thinking of doing something about it?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jed looked down at his hands, scarred from years of ranch work, steady despite his age, capable of gentleness when it mattered. Sarah used to tease him about those hands, how they could mend a broken fence in the morning and stroke her hair with infinite tenderness at night. She'd believed in his capacity for kindness, even when he'd forgotten it himself. "Maybe," he said. Doc reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card that had seen better days. "If you do decide to help that mare, you call me, day or night. Some things are worth the risk." Martha rang up Jed's supplies with hands that trembled slightly. As she bagged his groceries, she slipped in an extra can of coffee and a package of sugar cubes, the kind horses loved. When Jed raised an eyebrow, she just smiled. "Sometimes we all need a little extra sweetness in our lives," she said. The drive home took longer than usual. Jed found himself slowing as he approached the rutted dirt road that led to Cartwright's property. The mare was still there, standing motionless in her tiny pen. Even from a distance, he could see the dejected slope of her neck, the way she held herself apart from hope. The wooden sign seemed to mock him as he finally drove past. "Too wild," as if wildness was something to be ashamed of, something to be crushed rather than understood. As if the desire for freedom were a character flaw instead of the most natural thing in the world. That evening, Jed sat on his front porch with his father's journal open across his knees. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah had always called God's way of saying goodnight. He turned to a page he'd marked years ago, back when they'd first talked about rescuing horses that others had given up on. "Every horse has a story," Thomas Crow had written. "Most of the time, It's a story about people who gave up too soon. The horse remembers every hand that struck it, every voice that shouted in anger, every moment it was made to feel worthless. But here's the miracle: they also remember every act of kindness. They hold on to those small mercies like treasures, and if you're patient enough, if you're quiet enough, they'll show you where they've hidden them. Jed closed the journal and looked out across his empty pastures. Tomorrow, he decided, he would drive back to Cartwright's place. Not to cause trouble, not to make demands, but to see if maybe, just maybe, there was a story worth saving behind that cruel sign. Sarah would have done it without hesitation. The least he could do was honor her memory by trying to find the courage she'd always seen in him. The chain around Jed's neck felt heavier than usual as he parked his truck at the edge of Cartwright's property the next morning. Sarah's wedding ring, which he'd worn close to his heart since the day he buried her, seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, a gentle reminder of the woman who'd taught him that love meant standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The mare looked worse in daylight. Her ribs showed clearly beneath a coat that should have gleamed with health, and her water trough was bone dry, despite the morning heat, already building toward what promised to be a scorching day. The two wild signs swayed in the breeze, its red letters faded but still cruel in their judgment. Ben Cartwright emerged from the shadows of his barn like a man who'd been waiting for an excuse to cause trouble. At 55, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd learned early that money could substitute for most virtues. His belt buckle caught the sunlight, sterling silver and big as a dinner plate, the kind of ostentatious display that announced its owner's insecurity to anyone paying attention. "You lost, Crow." Cartwright's voice carried the lazy menace of a man who'd never learned to fear consequences. "Saw your sign yesterday," Jed replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Wondered what you're asking for the mare." Cartwright's laugh was ugly. "That piece of worthless horseflesh? She's barren, mean as a rattlesnake, and dumber than a post. Been trying to get rid of her for months." Jed studied the mare more carefully. She stood in the farthest corner of her pen, as far from the two men as the cramped space would allow. But her ears were forward, alert, and her eyes, those deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of disappointment, tracked every movement with intelligence. "She looks sound enough," Jed said. "Looks can fool you. Trust me, I've tried everything with her. She won't breed, won't work, won't even let you get close without trying to take your head off. I'm about ready to put her out of everyone's misery." The casual cruelty in those words made Jed's jaw tighten. Sarah's ring seemed to grow warm against his chest, and he could almost hear her voice in his ear. "Some creatures just need someone to see past their fear to who they really are." "What are you asking?" Jed repeated. Cartwright studied him with eyes that missed nothing. "You serious? Because I'm telling you, this mare ain't worth the powder to blow her to hell. She's got nothing but meanness left in her. Let me be the judge of that." For a long moment, the two men faced each other across 20 feet of dusty ground. The mare watched them both, her body tense with the kind of alertness that spoke of too many bad experiences with raised voices and sudden movements. 200, Cartwright said finally, "and that's highway robbery for a horse that ain't good for nothing but dog food." Jed pulled out his wallet without another word. The bills were crisp money he'd been saving for repairs to the barn roof that could wait another season. As he counted out the 20s, he caught the mare watching him, with what looked almost like hope flickering in her dark eyes. "You're making a mistake," Cartwright said as he pocketed the cash. "Don't come crying to me when she puts you in the hospital. Or worse. I'll need a bill of sale." "Sure thing." Cartwright disappeared into his office and returned with a handwritten receipt that looked like it had been prepared in advance. The mare's name was listed as Bay Mare, approx. 8 years, no breeding record. No mention of her bloodline, her training, or anything else that might hint at her true value. Loading the mare proved to be a challenge that said more about her past treatment than any document could have. She balked at the trailer ramp, eyes rolling white with terror at the sight of the enclosed space. Jed spent the better part of an hour just standing near the trailer, letting her get used to his presence, talking to her in the low, steady voice his father had taught him to use with frightened animals. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I know you've got no reason to trust me yet, but I'm not like the others. We're going somewhere better. I promise you that." When she finally stepped into the trailer, it was with the resignation of someone who'd learned that fighting only made things worse. The sound of her hooves on the metal floor was hollow, defeated. Jed secured the lead rope with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from anger at what he saw in her broken posture. The drive back to his place was slow and careful. Every few minutes, he checked the rearview mirror, watching for signs of distress from his passenger. The mare stood perfectly still, as if moving might draw unwanted attention to herself. It was the behavior of an animal who'd learned that invisibility was survival. At his homestead, Jed backed the trailer up to the gate of his largest pasture, 20 acres of good grass, with a creek running through the middle and shade trees scattered throughout. It was the kind of space Sarah had always dreamed of filling with rescued horses, though they'd never gotten around to making that dream real. The mare hesitated at the trailer's edge, as if paradise might be another kind of trap. Jed unhooked the lead rope and stepped back, giving her room to make her own choice. For several heartbeats, they faced each other, the broken horse and the grieving man, both carrying scars that wouldn't show on any veterinary examination. Then she stepped down. The grass beneath her hooves seemed to surprise her. She lowered her head tentatively, as if expecting to be yanked away from the simple pleasure of fresh grazing. When no harsh voice or heavy hand intervened, she took another step, then another, until she was 20 feet from the trailer and moving with something that wasn't quite freedom but was getting closer to it. Jed watched her explore her new home with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The satisfaction came from seeing her begin to relax, her head coming up as she tested the wind and found no immediate threats. The sorrow came from recognizing the depth of damage that had been done to her, the way she started at every sound, the careful way she positioned herself so she could see all approaches, the defeated slope of her shoulders that spoke of expectations repeatedly crushed. That evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and his father's journal, watching the mare graze in the distance. She'd found a spot near the creek where she could drink without exposing her back to potential danger, and she'd positioned herself so that the slightest movement from the house would send her to the far end of the pasture. "Patience," Jed read from one of his father's entries. "That's the first gift you give a horse that's been hurt. Not medicine, not food, not even love. Just patience. Time to remember that the world doesn't always mean harm." As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jed found himself talking to Sarah for the first time in months. Not the desperate, one-sided conversations he'd held in the dark hours after her death, but the kind of sharing they used to do at the end of each day. "I think she's got babies somewhere," he told the empty chair beside him. "The way she keeps looking toward the hills, like she's lost something precious." Cartwright said she was barren, but that man's got more lies than the devil himself. The mare lifted her head at the sound of his voice, ears pricked in his direction. For just a moment, their eyes met across the distance of the pasture. Then she went back to grazing, but she didn't move away. It was the smallest of victories, but Jed felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. Hope, maybe, or purpose, or simply the recognition that sometimes saving someone else was the only way to save yourself. The wedding ring lay warm against his heart as he finally went inside, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Jed Crow went to sleep, planning for tomorrow, instead of mourning yesterday. In the tack room of his barn, tucked away in a wooden chest that hadn't been opened in years, Jed found what he was looking for. 2 small halters, sized for foals, lay wrapped in an old horse blanket, alongside a collection of other equipment he and Sarah had bought, in hopeful anticipation of the horses they'd planned to raise together. The leather was still supple, the brass fittings bright, despite years of storage. Sarah had picked them out herself during a trip to the county fair, running her fingers over the soft leather while she talked about the colts and fillies they'd someday gentle and train. "Every baby deserves something beautiful," she'd said, and insisted on the more expensive halters, with their tooled designs and careful stitching. Now, holding them in his weathered hands, Jed felt the weight of dreams deferred and opportunities lost. But also something else, a sense that maybe those dreams were simply waiting for their proper time. The mare had been with him for 3 days now, and each morning brought small signs of progress. She no longer bolted to the far fence when he stepped onto the porch. Yesterday, she'd actually remained grazing while he filled her water trough, though she kept one eye on him throughout the process. Most encouraging of all, she'd begun to whinny softly each evening around sunset, calling toward the hills in the distance, with a sound that was part longing, part hope. Jed had heard answering calls. This morning, he'd risen before dawn and positioned himself with binoculars at the highest point on his property. The rocky outcropping gave him a clear view of the maze of canyons and ridges that stretched toward the national forest boundary. For nearly an hour, he'd seen nothing but the usual wildlife, a few deer picking their way down to water, a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead, a coyote trotting across an open meadow with something dangling from its jaws. Then movement in a distant draw caught his attention. 2 horses, small and quick, emerging from a stand of pinyon pines to drink from a seasonal creek. Even at this distance, he could see they were young, probably yearlings, based on their size and the way they moved, with the uncertain grace of adolescence still growing into their bodies. They stayed in the open for less than 5 minutes, but it was long enough for Jed to confirm what he'd suspected since the first night. The mare's calls weren't random expressions of loneliness. She was calling to her children. The discovery filled him with equal parts joy and frustration. Joy at understanding the true source of the mare's sorrow, frustration at the cruel separation that had driven a mother to desperation. Cartwright had lied about more than just her temperament. This wasn't a barren mare, this was a grieving mother whose babies had been taken from her and abandoned to survive on their own. Patience, Jed reminded himself, echoing his father's most frequent advice. But patience felt like a luxury when those foals were out there facing predators, weather, and the dozen other dangers that claimed young horses in the wild. Every day they remained separated, increased the risk that reunion might become impossible. He spent the morning working on repairs around the homestead, but his mind kept wandering to the logistics of what he was contemplating. Capturing 2 wild-raised foals would require more than good intentions. It would need careful planning, the right equipment, and probably help from someone with more experience than he had with truly feral horses. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of Ben Cartwright's black pickup truck, its oversized tires and chrome exhaust stacks making it look more like a statement of aggression than a working vehicle. Cartwright climbed out with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted his presence to be felt before his words were heard. 2 men accompanied him, hired hands by the look of them, the kind who were paid more for their willingness to follow orders without asking questions than for their skill with livestock. "Afternoon, Crow," Cartwright called, his tone carrying a false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're getting along with that mare." Jed set down his hammer and faced the 3 men. The mare, grazing near the creek, had lifted her head at the sound of voices. Even from 100 yards away, he could see the tension that had crept into her posture at the sight of her former owner. "She's settling in fine," Jed replied carefully. "Glad to hear it. Real glad." Cartwright's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I was talking to some folks in town yesterday, and your name came up. Seems there's been some concern about horses running loose in the forest land, up behind your property." "That's so. Federal land, you understand. Can't have private livestock wandering around where they don't belong. Environmental impact and all that. I've volunteered to help round up any strays we might find." The threat wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Cartwright was serving notice that he knew about the foals and that he intended to reclaim them legally or otherwise. "Appreciate your civic spirit," Jed said, "though I imagine the Forest Service is capable of handling their own business." One of Cartwright's men, a scarred, lean individual who looked like he'd been on the wrong end of too many bar fights, spat tobacco juice into the dust near Jed's boots. It was a small insult, but calculated to provoke a reaction. Jed didn't give him the satisfaction. "Thing is," Cartwright continued, "some of those horses might have belonged to folks around here before they got loose. Property has a way of finding its way back to its rightful owners, if you know what I mean." "I'm sure it does." The mare had begun pacing along the fence line, her distress evident in every line of her body. She remembered these men, remembered what their presence meant. Her soft whinnying carried clearly across the pasture, not the evening calls to her distant foals, but the sharp, anxious sounds of a mother in fear for her young. "Well," Cartwright said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, "we'll let you get back to your business. Just wanted to make sure we understood each other." "Crystal clear," Jed replied. As the truck pulled away, leaving another cloud of dust hanging in the still air, Jed walked toward the pasture fence. The mare approached as closely as she dared, still 20 feet away, but closer than she'd ever come when he was standing upright. Her dark eyes held a mixture of gratitude and desperate pleading that cut him to the bone. "I know, girl," he said softly. "I know what he took from you, and I promise you this, we're going to get them back." That evening, Jed called Doc Peterson from his kitchen phone. The conversation was brief and careful, the kind of coded discussion that happened when both parties understood they might be walking into legally questionable territory. "I might need some veterinary advice in the next few days," Jed said. "What kind of advice?" "The kind that involves young horses that might have been living rough for a while, might need some medical attention when they come home." Doc was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent 70 years learning the difference between law and justice. "Day or night," he said. "You call me day or night." After hanging up, Jed returned to the porch with his father's journal and the 2 small halters. The mare stood silhouetted against the sunset, her head turned toward the hills where her children waited for a mother's love to find them. The leather halters felt warm in his hands, full of promise and purpose. Tomorrow, he would begin the careful work of earning trust not just from the mare, but from 2 frightened young horses who had learned to survive without protection, without comfort, without the gentle guidance every foal deserved. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be legal, depending on how Cartwright chose to play his cards. But as Jed sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the mare's evening calls and the faint answering whinnies that drifted down from the distant hills, he knew with absolute certainty that some things were worth whatever risks they demanded. Sarah would have understood. Sarah would have been proud. The faded photograph had been tucked inside his father's journal for so long that Jed had forgotten it was there. He discovered it while reading by lamplight, studying the sections on working with feral horses. The picture slipped from between the yellowed pages like a message from another lifetime. Sarah smiled back at him from the photograph, her hair golden in the afternoon sunlight, her arm wrapped around his waist as they stood beside the empty pasture they'd planned to fill with rescued horses. He was younger then, his face unmarked by the deep lines that grief had carved around his eyes. They both looked so certain of the future, so confident that their dreams would unfold exactly as they'd imagined. "We'll start with 1 or 2. Sarah had said that day, her voice bright with anticipation. "Horses that nobody else wants, that have been given up on. We'll show them what love looks like again." Now, holding the photograph in hands that trembled slightly, Jed felt the full weight of promises delayed but not forgotten. The mare in his pasture was exactly the kind of horse Sarah had dreamed of saving. And somewhere in those hills, her foals were living the wild, dangerous existence that his wife had wanted so desperately to prevent. The plan formed slowly, carefully, like the solution to a puzzle that required more patience than speed. For 3 days, Jed had been making trips to different vantage points around his property, mapping the foal's movements and identifying their patterns. They were cleverer than horses their age should have needed to be. They avoided the obvious paths, stayed in cover during the brightest parts of the day, and never lingered in open areas longer than necessary. But they were still young, and young horses were creatures of habit even when those habits had been forced on them by survival rather than comfort. They watered at the same creek each morning just after sunrise, grazed in a particular meadow during the cooler evening hours, and bedded down in a sheltered canyon where wind patterns would carry the scent of approaching predators. The mare had become his unwitting ally in tracking them. Each evening, she positioned herself at the highest point of her pasture and called to her distant children. Their responses, faint but audible, helped Jed triangulate their location with increasing accuracy. More importantly, those evening conversations seemed to be drawing the foals closer. Last night, their answering calls had come from a ridge barely 2 miles away. On the 4th morning, Jed loaded his truck with supplies, a coil of soft rope, grain buckets, several flakes of the sweetest hay he could find, and the 2 small halters that had waited so long for their purpose. The mare watched his preparations with obvious anxiety, pacing the fence line and whinnying softly, as if she understood that something important was about to happen. "I'm going to bring them home," Jed told her, surprising himself with the words. He'd gotten into the habit of talking to her over the past week, finding comfort in her listening presence, even if she couldn't respond in kind. "Your babies, I'm going to bring them back to you." The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, and for just a moment, her pacing stopped. She stood perfectly still, head turned in his direction, as if she was actually listening to the promise he was making. The drive to the edge of the national forest took 20 minutes over increasingly rough terrain. Jed parked his truck in a grove of aspen trees where it would be hidden from casual observation, then shouldered his pack and began the careful hike toward the canyon where the foals had spent the previous night. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the high desert landscape spread around him in all its harsh beauty. This was country that had been testing men and animals for centuries, unforgiving terrain that rewarded the cautious and punished the reckless. Jed moved slowly, placing each step with deliberate care, stopping frequently to listen and scan the horizon. He found their tracks first small, unshod hoofprints in the soft earth near the creek. Fresh manure and disturbed grass confirmed that he'd chosen the right location. But the foals themselves remained invisible, hidden somewhere in the maze of rocks and brush that provided perfect camouflage for animals who had learned that visibility meant vulnerability. For 2 hours, Jed waited in the shadow of a large boulder, watching the meadow where the foals came to graze. His patience was finally rewarded when movement caught his eye, a flash of brown and white emerging from a screen of willows along the creek. The first foal was a colt, probably 14 months old, with the sturdy build and intelligent eyes of his mother. His coat was rough from living wild, and he carried several small scars that spoke of close encounters with predators or rough terrain. But he moved with confidence, head high and alert, as he tested the air for danger. The second foal appeared moments later, a filly slightly smaller than her brother, with the delicate features and graceful movement that suggested she would grow into a beautiful mare. She followed the colt's lead but stayed closer to cover, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Jed's heart clenched at the sight of them. They were magnificent despite their rough circumstances, carrying themselves with the proud, bearing that marked them as their mother's children. But they were also too thin, too wary, too wise in the ways of survival for horses so young. Moving with painful slowness, Jed began scattering grain in a line that led from the edge of the meadow toward his hiding place. The sweet scent would carry on the morning breeze, and hungry young horses would find it difficult to resist. Then he settled back to wait, knowing that patience was his greatest weapon in the delicate game he was about to play. The colt noticed the grain first, his nostrils flaring as he caught the unfamiliar but appealing scent. He approached cautiously, step by careful step, while his sister hung back and watched from the safety of the trees. When he finally lowered his head to investigate the scattered feed, Jed held his breath. The taste of sweet grain seemed to unlock some buried memory in the young horse. He ate eagerly, following the trail Jed had laid, while his sister gradually joined him. They were hungry, hungrier than wild horses should be in country that provided adequate forage. The harsh reality of their situation hit Jed like a physical blow. These weren't horses choosing to live free. They were abandoned children trying to survive circumstances that should never have been forced upon them. When both foals were focused on the grain less than 30 feet away, Jed began to move. Not toward them, that would have sent them fleeing back into the wilderness, but parallel to their position, letting them see him, but making no aggressive moves in their direction. The colt's head came up immediately, grain still hanging from his lips as he evaluated this new threat. The filly pressed close to her brother's side, ready to run. But the grain was too tempting, and Jed's movements were too slow and deliberate to trigger their deepest fears. "Easy now," Jed murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Your mama's been calling for you every night. She misses you something fierce." At the word "mama," both foals' ears pricked forward. Some part of them remembered. Some deep instinct recognized the connection Jed was offering. The filly took a tentative step toward him, then stopped, torn between curiosity and caution. The breakthrough came when the morning breeze shifted, carrying Jed's scent directly to the foals. Instead of bolting, they both raised their heads and breathed deeply, processing the information their noses provided. He smelled of their mother, of her sadness, her longing, her desperate love for the children she'd lost. The filly made the decision first. She walked toward Jed with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a possibly dangerous but irresistibly interesting mystery. When she was close enough to touch, she stretched out her neck and sniffed his outstretched hand. Her brother followed more slowly, but he followed nonetheless. Within minutes, Jed found himself surrounded by two young horses who seemed to understand, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that he represented their best chance of finding their way home. The walk back to the truck took 3 hours. The foals were willing to follow but unused to human direction, and every sound or sudden movement sent them skittering away in different directions. Jed's patience was tested again and again, but each time they came back, drawn by the promise of more grain and the scent of their mother that clung to his clothes. Loading them into the trailer proved impossible. They would approach the ramp, even put one tentative hoof on the metal surface, but something about the enclosed space triggered panic that no amount of coaxing could overcome. Finally, Jed made the decision to lead them home on foot, a journey that would take most of the day but would avoid the trauma of forced confinement. The mare knew they were coming long before they appeared on the horizon. Her behavior changed dramatically as the afternoon wore on, pacing, whinnying, running from one end of her pasture to the other with an energy Jed hadn't seen since the day he'd brought her home. By the time the small procession crested the final hill, she was calling constantly, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. The reunion was everything Jed had hoped for and more. The foals broke into a run when they saw their mother, all caution forgotten in the joy of rediscovered family. The mare met them at the fence, her neck stretched as far as the wire would allow, touching noses and breathing in their scent as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. The gate had never opened faster. Within moments, the 3 horses were together in the pasture, the mare nuzzling and inspecting her children while they pressed close to her sides. The sounds they made, soft nickering, gentle whinnies, the quiet snuffling of horses greeting beloved family, created a symphony of reunion that brought tears to Jed's eyes. Standing at his kitchen window that evening, watching the reunited family graze together in the fading light, Jed felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had since her death. She would have loved this moment, the sight of a mother's love conquering separation, the proof that broken families could be made whole again. The photograph still lay open on the kitchen table, Sarah's smile captured forever in that moment of shared dreams and endless possibility. But for the first time in 3 years, Jed didn't feel diminished by the comparison between what they'd planned and what he'd achieved alone. Instead, he felt Sarah's approval, her joy in the knowledge that their dreams hadn't died with her, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to bloom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Cartwright wouldn't accept the loss of the foals quietly, and there would be legal complications to navigate. But tonight, as the mare stood guard over her sleeping children under a sky full of stars, Jed allowed himself to believe that some stories really could have happy endings. The hand-carved wooden horse sat on Jed's mantelpiece like a monument to dreams deferred. He'd whittled it during the long winter months after Sarah's diagnosis, when the doctors had used words like aggressive and terminal, and she'd still insisted on planning for the children they'd never been able to have. "Every child needs something beautiful to hold on to," she'd said, running her fingers over the smooth wood, "even the ones who only exist in our hearts." Now, watching the mare teach her foals to trust again in the safety of his pasture, Jed understood what Sarah had really been trying to tell him. Love didn't require blood relations or legal documents. Sometimes it just required showing up when someone needed you most. The 3 horses had been together for a week, and the transformation was remarkable. The mare's depression had lifted like morning fog, replaced by the fierce protectiveness and gentle guidance of a mother reclaimed. She stood sentinel while her children grazed, positioning herself between them and any potential threat, including Jed, though her wariness of him had softened considerably since the reunion. The foals were learning to be horses again instead of survivors. The colt had begun to play, racing in wide circles around the pasture with the exuberant energy of youth freed from constant vigilance. His sister was more cautious, staying closer to their mother, but even she had started to exhibit the curiosity and boldness that should characterize a healthy young horse. Jed had taken to spending his mornings on the porch with coffee and his father's journal, watching the small family navigate their new reality. It was better than television, more engaging than any book. The subtle communications between mare and foals, the gradual establishment of trust and routine, the simple miracle of seeing creatures learn to feel safe again, it filled something in Jed's chest that had been empty for too long. The sound of approaching vehicles shattered the morning peace. Not one truck this time, but 3 Ben Cartwright's black pickup, flanked by 2 official-looking SUVs with government plates. Jed set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, but his pulse quickened as he recognized the uniforms of the men climbing out of the vehicles. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the lead SUV with the uncomfortable expression of a man being forced to do a job he didn't particularly want to do. At 62, Morrison had served Sagebrush County for nearly 3 decades, and his weather-beaten face bore the lines of someone who'd learned to navigate the treacherous waters between law and politics. The second vehicle disgorged 2 men in the crisp uniforms of federal wildlife officers, the kind of officials who dealt with cases involving national forest land and livestock violations. They moved with the brisk efficiency of people accustomed to resistance and prepared to overcome it. Cartwright brought up the rear, his swagger more pronounced than usual. He'd traded his working clothes for a pressed shirt and clean jeans, the outfit of a man going to court or conducting important business. His smile was all teeth and vindication. "Morning, Jed," Sheriff Morrison called, his tone carefully neutral. "Sorry to disturb you so early, but we've got some business to discuss." Jed walked down from the porch slowly, keeping his hands visible and his expression calm. The horses had retreated to the far end of the pasture at the sound of multiple vehicles, the mare placing herself protectively between her foals and the gathered men. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" One of the federal officers stepped forward, a clipboard in his hand and authority in his voice. "I'm Officer Bradley, U.S. Forest Service. We've received reports of livestock trespassing on federal land. We're here to investigate those reports and, if necessary, to remove any animals that don't belong there." I see, Jed replied carefully. All my animals are on my property, as you can see. That's not entirely accurate, Cartwright interjected, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd finally found the angle he needed. Those 2 yearlings came from federal land. They've been running wild up there for months, causing environmental damage and posing a safety hazard to legitimate users of the forest. Officer Bradley consulted his clipboard. Mr. Cartwright has filed a complaint alleging that wild horses removed from Forest Service land are now being harbored on private property without proper documentation or permits. The legal trap was elegantly constructed and brutally effective. By rescuing the foals from federal land, Jed had technically committed a crime, even though those same foals had only been on federal land because Cartwright had abandoned them there in the first place. I'd like to see your documentation for those horses, the second federal officer said, gesturing toward the pasture where the 3 animals watched with obvious anxiety. Jed pulled the handwritten bill of sale from his wallet, the piece of paper that documented his purchase of 1 mare and made no mention of any foals. The officer examined it briefly, then shook his head. This doesn't cover those 2 yearlings. According to our records, horses without proper ownership documentation found on federal land become the property of the United States government. They need to be removed immediately. Now hold on, Jed said, his temper beginning to fray despite his efforts at self-control. Those foals belong with their mother. You can't just— Actually, we can, Officer Bradley interrupted. Federal regulations are quite clear on this matter. Wild or abandoned horses on Forest Service land are subject to removal and either adoption through proper channels or— He paused, consulting his clipboard again. Or disposal if they're deemed unsuitable for adoption. The euphemism hung in the air like a death sentence. Disposal, as if the foals were broken equipment rather than living creatures who had finally found their way back to safety and love. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his expression making it clear that he understood the real dynamics at play, but felt powerless to intervene. Jed, I'm sorry, but if these horses came from federal land without proper documentation, they're not wild horses, Jed said, his voice rising despite his best efforts. They're domestic animals that were abandoned and left to fend for themselves. There's a difference. Can you prove that? Officer Bradley asked. Do you have registration papers, vaccination records, anything that establishes their domestic status? Of course he couldn't prove it. Cartwright had made sure of that by never providing proper documentation for any of his animals. The man had built his entire operation on legal grey areas and bureaucratic gaps, always staying just on the right side of the law while inflicting maximum cruelty. I need to make some phone calls, Jed said, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. Talk to my veterinarian, check my records. I'm afraid we can't wait for that, the second officer said. We have a livestock trailer standing by. The animals need to be removed today. As if summoned by those words, another vehicle appeared on the horizon, a large truck pulling a battered livestock trailer. The sight of it sent the mare into a panic. She began pacing frantically, calling to her foals with the desperate urgency of a mother who sensed approaching disaster. The foals responded to their mother's distress by pressing close to her sides, their eyes rolling white with fear. They remembered trailers, remembered separation, remembered the terror of being taken from everything familiar and safe. You can't do this, Jed said, the words torn from him by the sight of the panicked horses. These animals have been through enough. They're finally safe, finally together. Mr. Crow, Officer Bradley said, his tone suggesting he'd had this conversation many times before, I understand your emotional attachment to these animals. But the law is the law. These horses will be processed through proper channels. If they're truly domestic animals with legitimate ownership, that will be determined during the evaluation process. The evaluation process, another euphemism for a system designed to funnel unwanted horses towards slaughter while maintaining plausible deniability for the officials who administered it. Cartwright was practically glowing with satisfaction as the trailer backed up to the pasture gate. "Should have minded your own business, Crow. Some lessons come harder than others." As the trailer door swung open with a metallic clang that echoed across the pasture like a funeral bell, Jed felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, which had already been shattered and slowly mended, but his faith in the idea that doing the right thing would somehow be enough. The mare's calls became increasingly frantic as strange men entered her sanctuary with ropes and halters. Her foals huddled against her flanks, trembling with terror as the trailer yawned open like the mouth of some mechanical predator. Standing in his own yard, surrounded by officials enforcing laws that protected the powerful at the expense of the innocent, Jed Crow finally understood what his father had meant when he wrote about the difference between legal and right. Sometimes a man had to choose which one mattered more. Sheriff Morrison's badge caught the morning sunlight as he stood between Jed and the federal officers, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man caught between duty and conscience. The star-shaped piece of metal had been polished to mirror brightness, but Jed could see the tarnish around its edges, the kind of wear that came from years of compromises and difficult choices. "Now hold on a minute," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Before we start loading horses, I need to verify some things. This is still my county, and I've got questions about the chain of custody here." Officer Bradley's jaw tightened with the frustration of a federal employee unaccustomed to having his authority challenged by local officials. "Sheriff, this is a straightforward case of livestock removal from federal property. The documentation is all in order." "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't." Morrison's tone was deceptively casual, but Jed caught the steel underneath. "But I've been dealing with Ben Cartwright's operation for years now, and I've learned to ask pointed questions when his name comes up in official complaints." Cartwright's swagger faltered slightly. "Now see here, Morrison." "No, you see here." The sheriff's voice cut through Cartwright's protest like a blade. "I've had 3 different ranchers file complaints about missing horses in the past 6 months. All of them described animals that supposedly wandered onto forest land and disappeared. Funny thing is, all those complaints had your name attached as the person reporting the strays. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a prairie fire." Officer Bradley glanced between Morrison and Cartwright, clearly sensing undercurrents he hadn't been briefed on. The second federal officer took a step back from the group, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Are you suggesting?" Bradley began. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Morrison interrupted. "But I am saying that before we start seizing animals from a man's private property, I want to see some proof that those animals didn't belong to him in the first place." Jed felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. Morrison might be bound by politics and bureaucracy, but he was also a lawman with 30 years of experience reading people and situations. More importantly, he was a neighbor who understood the difference between legal technicalities and justice. "The documentation clearly states," Officer Bradley tried again, "the documentation states that wild horses were found on federal land." Morrison cut him off. "But what if they weren't wild? What if they were domestic animals that had been deliberately abandoned there?" Cartwright's face had gone pale beneath his perpetual tan. "That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. I hope you can back it up." "Oh, I can back up quite a bit, Ben. Question is whether you want me to do it here in front of federal officers or whether you'd prefer to have this conversation down at my office." The standoff stretched taut between the 2 men. Years of careful maneuvering and barely concealed antagonism finally coming to a head. Cartwright had always been careful to stay just within legal boundaries, but Morrison's words suggested that those boundaries might not be as secure as he'd believed. "Sheriff," the second federal officer said carefully, "if you have evidence of criminal activity related to this case, we need to know about it. Livestock theft on federal property is a federal crime." Morrison nodded slowly. "I'm aware of that. And I think before we go any further, we need to establish exactly how these horses ended up where they were found." "They're wild horses," Cartwright insisted, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Been running loose for months. Probably born out there. Funny thing about that, Morrison said, pulling a small notebook from his shirt pocket. I've been keeping track of reports about these particular animals. According to my notes, they were first spotted on forest land, just 3 days after you claimed that mare was barren and worthless. Jed's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. 3 days after he'd bought the mare, after Cartwright had realized he might have made a mistake in selling her so cheaply, the foals had suddenly appeared on federal land as wild horses. It was an elegant scheme. Abandon the foals where they'd become government property, then use official channels to reclaim them while making Jed look like a criminal for trying to reunite them with their mother. That's quite a coincidence. Morrison continued, his tone making it clear he didn't believe in coincidences. Almost like someone wanted those foals to end up where they'd be classified as government property. Officer Bradley was beginning to look uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Federal officers were trained to deal with clear-cut violations of wildlife regulations, not complex cases involving local politics and potential fraud. Sheriff, he said carefully, do you have evidence to support these allegations? I have statements from 3 ranchers describing missing horses that match the description of animals found on forest land. I have dates and locations that form a suspicious pattern. And I have 30 years of experience dealing with Ben Cartwright's creative interpretations of property law. The mare had been watching the proceedings from across the pasture, her foals pressed close to her sides. As if sensing the shift in momentum, she began walking toward the fence, her steps deliberate and unafraid for the first time since the officials had arrived. Look at her, Jed said, his voice carrying clearly across the tension-filled yard. Look at how she's moving, how she's holding herself. That's not a wild horse. That's a domestic animal who knows she's on her own property with her own family. The mare approached the fence and stood calmly, her dark eyes fixed on the gathering of men. Her foals flanked her, still nervous but drawing confidence from their mother's composure. It was a tableau that spoke more eloquently than any documentation could have a family unit, bonded and secure, displaying the trust and domestication that came only from proper handling and care. Those aren't wild horses, Morrison said quietly. Wild horses don't approach humans like that. They don't stand calmly near groups of strangers. They sure as hell don't trust their young ones to be exposed and vulnerable. Officer Bradley studied the horses for a long moment, his trained eye taking in details that Cartwright's hasty documentation had failed to address. The mare's hooves, properly trimmed despite her rough treatment, the way the foals responded to her subtle signals, the evidence of human contact in their behavior and condition. Mr. Cartwright, Bradley said slowly, I'm going to need to see your documentation for the original acquisition of these animals. Bills of sale, registration papers, veterinary records, everything you have. I don't have to provide anything to you, Cartwright blustered, but there was desperation creeping into his voice. This is a federal matter. You have your orders. Actually, the second officer said, consulting his own clipboard, if there's evidence that these animals were illegally abandoned on federal property, this becomes a criminal investigation. That changes everything. The livestock trailer sat empty and waiting, its metal ramp gleaming in the morning sun like a bridge to nowhere. But the men who had come to use it were no longer focused on loading horses. They were focused on the web of lies and half-truths that was beginning to unravel in the clear light of scrutiny. Morrison stepped closer to Cartwright, his badge catching the light as he moved. Ben, I think you and I need to have a private conversation, right now. As the 2 men walked toward Morrison's vehicle, leaving the federal officers to re-evaluate their mission, Jed felt the first full breath he'd taken since the convoy arrived. The crisis wasn't over. There would still be paperwork, investigations, and legal complications to navigate. But for the first time since this ordeal began, justice seemed like more than just a distant possibility. The mare whinnied softly, and her foals answered with the quiet sounds of young horses comfortable in their own space, safe, for now, in the pasture that had become their sanctuary. The bill of sale looked innocent enough: yellowed paper, faded ink, the kind of document that changed hands 100 times in the horse business. But as Doc Peterson held it up to the light streaming through Jed's kitchen window, the deception became clear. The paper was old, but the ink wasn't. Someone had taken great care to forge a document that would stand up to casual inspection, but wouldn't survive the kind of scrutiny that Morrison's investigation was certain to bring. "This is interesting," Doc said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Very interesting indeed." The federal officers had left 2 hours earlier, taking their trailer with them, but leaving behind a promise to return once Sheriff Morrison completed his preliminary investigation. Cartwright had departed even more reluctantly, his usual swagger replaced by the tight-lipped anger of a man whose carefully constructed plans were coming apart at the seams. "What did you find?" Jed asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The morning's revelations had already turned his simple act of compassion into something far more complex and dangerous. Doc set the forged bill of sale on the kitchen table beside 2 other documents he'd produced from his medical bag papers that Jed hadn't known existed until Morrison's questions had prompted the veterinarian to admit he'd been conducting his own quiet investigation. "Your mare isn't just any horse, Jed. She's registered bloodstock. Premium breeding material worth considerably more than the $200 you paid for her." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. He'd known the mare was special. Her intelligence, her conformation, the way she carried herself had all suggested quality breeding. But he'd assumed those qualities had been what made her so attractive to Cartwright in the first place, not that they represented something valuable enough to kill for. "How much more?" he asked. Doc consulted one of his documents, a photocopied registration certificate that looked far more official than anything Cartwright had ever produced. Conservative estimate? $50,000, maybe more, depending on her bloodlines and breeding history. The number hung in the air like an accusation. $50,000, more money than Jed had seen at one time since Sarah's medical bills had cleaned out their savings. More than enough to explain Cartwright's desperate attempts to reclaim the mare and her foals. "There's more," Doc continued, spreading the papers across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. "I've been tracking missing horses for the past year, animals that disappeared from ranches across 3 counties, all of them valuable breeding stock, all of them reported as strays or runaways, and all of them connected, somehow, to Ben Cartwright." Jed studied the documents with growing amazement and horror. Registration papers, veterinary records, insurance claims, all painting a picture of a systematic operation designed to steal valuable horses and then legitimize their ownership through forged documentation and bureaucratic manipulation. "This mare," Doc said, pointing to a photograph attached to one of the registration certificates, "was reported stolen from a ranch in Colorado 8 months ago. Her name is Moonlight Serenade, and she's descended from some of the finest quarter-horse bloodlines in the country." The photograph showed a mare in perfect condition, sleek coat, bright eyes, the picture of health and careful breeding. It was recognizably the same animal that now grazed in Jed's pasture, but the contrast was heartbreaking. What Cartwright had done to her went beyond simple neglect into the realm of deliberate cruelty. "The foals?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Born after she was stolen, probably sired by one of Cartwright's stallions, which means they're technically his property if he could prove ownership of the mare. But since she's stolen property, any offspring would belong to her legal owner." The implications were staggering. Jed had stumbled into the middle of a horse theft ring that operated across state lines, using federal land as a convenient dumping ground for animals that became inconvenient or difficult to explain. Cartwright's operation was far more sophisticated than anyone had suspected, hiding behind the facade of a legitimate ranching business while systematically stealing some of the most valuable horses in the region. "How did you figure all this out?" Jed asked. Doc's expression was grim. "I started noticing patterns about 6 months ago. Horses showing up at Cartwright's place with injuries that didn't match his stories about how he'd acquired them. Animals that were clearly well-bred and well-trained, but were being sold off as problem horses or strays. When I started asking questions, I began to get threats. What kind of threats? The kind that suggested I should stick to treating sick cattle and leave the horse business to people who understood it better. Doc's hands trembled slightly as he gathered the papers. I'm 71 years old, Jed. Too old to be playing detective, but I'm also too old to ignore what I've been seeing. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of the horses moving around their pasture. Through the window, Jed could see Moonlight Serenade. He found it easier to think of her by her real name, now grazing peacefully with her foals. They looked like any other horse family enjoying a quiet morning, not the victims, and evidence of a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states. What happens now? Jed asked. Now we call the people who have the authority to do something about this. Doc pulled a business card from his wallet, the kind of thick, official cardstock that government agencies used. I've been in contact with a federal investigator who specializes in livestock theft. She's been tracking this operation for longer than I have. The business card belonged to Special Agent Rebecca Torres, United States Department of Agriculture, Criminal Investigation Division. The title alone was enough to make Jed's head spin. He'd gone from rescuing one mistreated horse to becoming a witness in a federal criminal investigation. She's going to want to talk to you, Doc continued, about everything: how you acquired the mare, where you found the foals, what Cartwright said and did. Your testimony could be crucial to building a case against him. And the horses? Doc smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. The horses stay with you, at least until their legal ownership is sorted out. And given what Cartwright put them through, I suspect the original owner in Colorado will be very grateful to know they're in good hands. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of an approaching vehicle announced another visitor. But this time, it was Martha Henley's familiar pickup truck, dust billowing behind it as she navigated the dirt road with more speed than usual. She climbed out of the cab with the brisk efficiency of a woman on a mission, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the determined expression that had made her the unofficial coordinator of every community crisis for the past 4 decades. I brought lunch, she announced, though it was barely 10 in the morning. Figured you boys might need some sustenance while you're solving crimes and saving horses. Doc and Jed exchanged glances. In a community as small as theirs, news traveled faster than radio waves, and Martha's arrival meant that word of the morning's events had already reached town. What exactly did you hear? Doc asked carefully. Martha set the casserole dish on the counter and fixed them both with a look that brooked no evasion. I heard that Ben Cartwright finally overplayed his hand, that those federal boys left without taking any horses, and that you two have been sitting here for 2 hours, looking at papers like a couple of lawyers. She paused, studying their faces with the keen perception of someone who'd been reading people for 6 decades. I also heard that maybe it's time someone did something about all the strange things that have been happening around here lately. Martha, Jed began, but she held up a hand to stop him. Don't Martha me, Jed Crow. I've been watching that man operate for years, seeing things that didn't add up, hearing stories that didn't ring true. If there's finally a chance to set things right, then I want to help. The simple declaration carried the weight of absolute conviction. Martha Henley had spent her entire adult life serving her community, and she wasn't about to stop now just because the stakes had gotten higher. Doc gathered the papers into a neat stack and looked at his 2 companions. In that case, I think it's time to make that phone call to Agent Torres. This investigation is about to get a lot more interesting. Sarah's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its leather binding worn smooth by years of faithful use. Pressed wildflowers marked passages she'd turned to during the darkest days of her illness. Purple lupine from their first spring together, yellow buttercups from the meadow where he'd proposed, delicate wild roses from the fence line she'd loved so much. In the margins, her careful handwriting offered encouragement that transcended death. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Jed traced the familiar words with a fingertip, drawing strength from the faith that had sustained Sarah through trials that would have broken lesser souls. Tomorrow, he would need every ounce of that strength. Agent Torres was coming with a team of federal investigators. Sheriff Morrison was preparing search warrants, and Cartwright was undoubtedly planning his own desperate countermoves. The phone had been ringing all afternoon. Neighbors who'd heard fragments of the morning's drama, reporters from the county newspaper, even a call from the Colorado ranch owner who'd driven all night after Doc Peterson contacted him about Moonlight Serenade. The story was spreading beyond the boundaries of Sagebrush Flats, taking on a life of its own as word spread about the horse theft ring that had been operating in plain sight for months. "You sure about this?" Doc asked from his position by the window, where he'd been keeping watch for any sign of unwanted visitors. "Once this gets rolling, there's no stopping it. Cartwright's got resources, connections. He's not going to go down easy." Jed closed the Bible gently, his decision made. "I'm sure. These horses deserve justice. All the horses he's stolen deserve justice." Martha bustled around the kitchen, preparing enough food to feed an army of investigators. She'd insisted on staying to help coordinate what she called the operation, though Jed suspected her real motivation was maternal, making sure he didn't face the coming storm alone. "That mare's been watching the road all day," she observed, glancing toward the pasture where Moonlight Serenade stood alert near the fence. "It's like she knows something important is happening." The mare did seem unusually aware of the activity around the house. Her foals grazed peacefully nearby, but she maintained constant vigilance, her dark eyes tracking every movement, every vehicle that passed on the distant highway. There was something almost regal about her bearing now that they knew her true identity, as if learning her real name had restored some essential part of her dignity. Agent Torres arrived just as the sun was setting, driving an unmarked sedan followed by 2 SUVs full of federal investigators. She was younger than Jed had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of quiet competence that marked career law enforcement officers. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp as they took in every detail of the homestead. "Mr. Crow, thank you for your cooperation. I know this hasn't been easy. Just want to see these horses safe," Jed replied, and Cartwright stopped. Torres nodded, pulling out a digital recorder. "We're going to need your complete statement about everything that's happened from the day you first saw the mare until this morning's confrontation. Every detail could be important." For the next 2 hours, Jed recounted the entire story while Agent Torres and her team took notes, asked clarifying questions, and photographed the horses from every conceivable angle. The mare submitted to the examination with surprising calm, as if she understood that these strangers meant her no harm. "The forensic veterinarian will be here first thing tomorrow," Torres explained as her team packed up their equipment. "We need to document every injury, every sign of mistreatment. It's going to be crucial evidence when this goes to trial." Doc Peterson had been quietly observing the proceedings, occasionally adding details that Jed had forgotten or overlooked. Now he stepped forward with the grim determination of a man who'd been carrying secrets too long. "Agent Torres, there's something else you need to know. Moonlight Serenade isn't the only stolen horse Cartwright's been holding. I've identified at least 6 others over the past year, all valuable breeding stock, all reported missing from ranches across the region." Torres's eyes sharpened. "Where are they now?" "That's what we need to find out. Some were sold quickly after he acquired them. Others," Doc's voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Others were disposed of when they became too difficult to handle or too recognizable to sell," Torres finished grimly. "We've seen this pattern before. Cartwright's operation is more extensive than we initially suspected." Martha had been listening from the kitchen doorway, her face pale but resolute. "There's more," she said quietly. "Things I've seen and heard over the years that I didn't understand at the time. She described late-night trailer movements, horses arriving and disappearing within days, conversations overheard in the general store about animals that didn't match their supposed histories. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a criminal enterprise that had been hiding in plain sight, protected by Cartwright's reputation and his connections to local officials. "We'll need written statements from all of you," Torres said. "This is going to be a complex prosecution. Cartwright has lawyers, political connections, and enough money to fight this every step of the way." Sheriff Morrison arrived as the federal team was preparing to leave, his expression grim in the porch light. "Thought you should know, Cartwright's been making calls all evening. Lawyers, bondsmen, people in the county government. Word is he's planning to claim this is all a misunderstanding, that he's the victim of harassment by federal agents." "Let him claim whatever he wants," Torres replied. "We've got enough evidence to hold him while we build the case. The search warrants will be executed at dawn." As the investigators drove away, leaving contrails of dust in the gathering darkness, Jed found himself alone on the porch with Sarah's Bible and the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when months of careful investigation would either triumph or collapse under the pressure of legal challenges and political influence. The mare approached the fence, her foals trailing behind her like shadows. In the moonlight, her coat gleamed with health restored and dignity reclaimed. She stood quietly, watching Jed with eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "Tomorrow's going to be rough, girl," he said softly, "but we've come too far to quit now." As if in response, she nickered gently, not the desperate calls of separation and longing she'd made during those first dark days, but the quiet sound of a horse at peace with her place in the world. Her foals pressed close to her sides, safe in the knowledge that their mother would protect them from whatever storms might come. Inside the house, Martha was setting up a command post at the kitchen table, maps of Cartwright's property, lists of witnesses, phone numbers for reporters and animal welfare organizations who would need to be contacted when the story broke. Doc Peterson was reviewing his veterinary files, preparing the medical evidence that would document years of systematic abuse. The pieces were in place. The evidence was gathered. The federal agents were ready to move. But as Jed sat in the darkness, listening to the gentle sounds of horses at rest and the distant howl of coyotes in the hills, he couldn't shake the feeling that Cartwright had one more card to play, something desperate and dangerous that would test everyone's resolve before the sun rose again. Sarah's Bible lay open beside him, the pressed flowers marking passages about courage in the face of adversity. "Be strong and courageous." One of her favorite verses read, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Tomorrow, he would need that courage more than ever. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, and the stakes could not be higher. Not just for Moonlight Serenade and her foals, but for all the horses that had suffered under Cartwright's cruelty, and for the principle that right must ultimately triumph over might. In the distance, a truck engine rumbled to life, then faded away toward town. Someone was moving in the darkness, preparing for the dawn. Jed could only hope that when morning came, it would bring the kind of justice that Sarah had always believed was possible, the kind that restored the broken and punished those who preyed on the innocent. The mare lifted her head, testing the night wind for scents and sounds that might signal danger. Finding nothing to alarm her, she returned to her quiet grazing, trusting in the sanctuary that Jed had provided and the promise that tomorrow would bring freedom from the shadows that had haunted her for so long. The antique Colt revolver hadn't been fired in 15 years, not since Jed's grandfather had passed and left it to him, along with the homestead and a lifetime's worth of hard-earned wisdom about standing up for what was right. The gun felt heavy in his hands as he checked the cylinder in the pre-dawn darkness, its weight carrying more than just steel and lead. It carried the responsibility of 3 generations of men who had learned that sometimes peace required the willingness to fight. Jed hadn't slept, none of them had. Martha dozed fitfully in Sarah's old rocking chair, while Doc Peterson maintained his vigil by the window, watching for any sign that Cartwright might try to move against them before the federal agents could execute their search warrants. The house felt like a fortress under siege, filled with the electric tension that comes before storms break. At 4:30 a.m., headlights appeared on the highway, not the organized convoy of federal vehicles they'd been expecting, but a single truck moving too fast for the winding dirt road that led to Jed's property. The engine noise grew louder, more aggressive, accompanied by the sound of other vehicles following at distance. "That's not the feds," Doc said grimly, his hand moving to the hunting rifle he'd brought from his truck. Jed stepped onto the porch, the Colt heavy in his belt but hidden beneath his jacket. The approaching truck was Cartwright's black pickup, its chrome exhaust stacks gleaming in the moonlight. Behind it came two more vehicles, a livestock trailer and another truck full of men whose faces were hidden in shadow. Moonlight Serenade sensed the danger before any of the humans did. She began pacing the fence line, calling frantically to her foals, with the desperate urgency of a mother who recognized mortal threat. The young horses responded by pressing close to her sides, their eyes wide with the terror that comes from genetic memory of predators and pursuit. Cartwright's truck skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust and gravel, its door slamming open with violent force. He emerged like a man possessed, his usual calculated demeanor replaced by the wild desperation of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "You son of a bitch!" he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the pre-dawn stillness. "You think you can destroy me with your lies and federal interference? Those horses belong to me." 5 men climbed out of the following vehicles, hired muscle with the hard faces and quick movements of people accustomed to violence. They spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off potential escape routes while their boss advanced toward the house with murderous intent. "Ben, you need to calm down and think about what you're doing," Jed called from the porch, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "The federal agents will be here any minute. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse," Cartwright laughed, but the sound held no humor, only the brittle edge of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "You have no idea how much worse this is going to get. Those horses are coming with me, and if you try to stop me, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short life." The mare's panic was infectious, spreading to her foals and filling the air with the sounds of terrified animals who had already suffered too much. She reared against the fence, her hooves striking the metal posts with ringing blows as she tried desperately to shield her children from the approaching threat. "You hear that?" Cartwright gestured toward the pasture, his eyes bright with something that looked like madness. "She knows who her real master is. She's calling for me to take her home." It was a grotesque misinterpretation of the mare's behavior, born from a mind that could no longer distinguish between fear and love, between submission and respect. Cartwright had lived so long in a world where power justified everything that he'd lost the ability to recognize the difference between loyalty and terror. Martha appeared in the doorway behind Jed, her face pale but determined. "Ben Cartwright, you get off this property right now. You have no right to be here, and those horses aren't yours to take." "Stay out of this, old woman," one of Cartwright's men growled, taking a step toward the porch. "This doesn't concern you." "Everything in this community concerns me," Martha replied, her voice carrying the authority of 60 years spent defending her neighbors. "And I'm telling you to leave before someone gets hurt." Doc Peterson moved to join them on the porch, his hunting rifle held at ready but not yet pointed at anyone. The sight of the weapon seemed to galvanize Cartwright's men, several of whom reached for guns of their own. "Now we're getting somewhere," Cartwright said with satisfaction. "You old fools want to play with guns? Let's see how brave you are when the shooting starts." The standoff crystallized into something deadly and irreversible. 6 armed men faced 3 defenders on a remote homestead where the nearest help was still 20 minutes away. In the pasture, 3 horses huddled together in terror while their fate hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in the next few minutes. Jed felt time slow to a crawl, each heartbeat stretching into eternity as he calculated odds and possibilities. His grandfather's Colt felt alive in his hands, filled with the weight of family history and the terrible necessity of the moment. Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, "Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." "Last chance, Crow," Cartwright said, his hand resting on the grip of his own weapon. "Give me those horses, or we'll take them over your dead body." In the distance, the faint sound of approaching vehicles carried on the morning air help was coming, but not soon enough to prevent what was about to happen. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for someone to make the choice that would determine whether this confrontation ended in justice or tragedy. Moonlight Serenade's terrified whinnying filled the air like a prayer for deliverance, while her foals pressed against her flanks and trembled with the knowledge that once again their world was about to be torn apart by human cruelty and greed. The legal documents that Agent Torres clutched in her hands as she emerged from the lead SUV represented more than just evidence. They were proof that truth could triumph over corruption, that patient investigation could unravel even the most carefully constructed web of lies. The federal convoy had arrived with perfect timing, their vehicles surrounding Cartwright's men before anyone could react to the changing dynamics of the confrontation. "Ben Cartwright, you're under arrest for interstate transportation of stolen livestock, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal wildlife protection statutes," Torres announced, her voice carrying the authority of the United States government. "Put your weapons down and step away from the vehicle." The transformation in Cartwright was instantaneous and complete. The desperate aggression that had driven him to this final, reckless gambit evaporated in the face of federal authority, replaced by the calculating mind of a businessman who understood when a deal had gone bad, beyond any possibility of salvage. His men, however, were slower to grasp the new reality. 3 of them had drawn their weapons before they noticed the federal agents taking position behind vehicles and natural cover, their rifles trained with the precision that came from extensive tactical training. The mathematical impossibility of their situation became clear within seconds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. "Drop your weapons," Agent Torres commanded, her own sidearm now visible and ready. "This is your only warning." The mayor's panic began to subside as she sensed the shift in the confrontation's tenor. She stopped her frantic pacing and turned her attention to the new arrivals, her intelligent eyes recognizing something different about these humans, an authority and competence that suggested safety rather than threat. One by one, Cartwright's men lowered their weapons and raised their hands, the fight draining out of them as they realized they'd been caught in the middle of something far larger than a simple dispute over livestock. Sheriff Morrison emerged from one of the federal vehicles, handcuffs ready and a grim smile on his weathered face. "Ben, you just made this whole process a lot easier," Morrison said as he approached the defeated rancher. "Attempted armed robbery, threatening federal witnesses, conspiracy. We've got enough charges to keep you busy for the next 20 years. Cartwright's surrender was as calculated as everything else he'd done. He offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place, his mind already working on legal strategies and plea bargains. But his eyes remained fixed on the horses in the pasture, and the hatred burning there suggested that his war against Jed and everything he represented was far from over. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, as Morrison led him toward the waiting vehicle. "You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you've started." Agent Torres ignored the threats, focusing instead on the evidence that was finally coming together after months of patient investigation. "Mr. Crow, we're going to need to examine the horses thoroughly, document their condition, and verify their identities against our missing livestock database." Doc Peterson stepped forward with a thick folder of veterinary records. "Agent Torres, I think you'll find that Moonlight Serenade is just the beginning. We've identified at least 8 other stolen horses that passed through Cartwright's operation in the past 18 months. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. As the morning progressed and more evidence was processed, it became clear that Cartwright had been running one of the most sophisticated livestock theft operations in the region's history. Forged documents, bribed officials, elaborate transportation networks. The investigation would take months to fully unravel. But for now, in the growing light of dawn, justice had finally arrived for 3 horses who had suffered too much and waited too long for someone to care enough to fight for them. Moonlight Serenade approached the fence with cautious curiosity, her foals following close behind as they investigated these new humans who moved with purpose rather than cruelty. "She's beautiful," Agent Torres said softly, studying the mare's elegant conformation and intelligent expression. "It's a miracle she survived what Cartwright put her through." Martha appeared on the porch with a tray of coffee and sandwiches, her practical nature asserting itself, even in the midst of federal operations and criminal arrests. "You boys look like you could use some sustenance," she announced. "Fighting crime is hungry work." As the agents and investigators settled into the methodical business of processing evidence and taking statements, Jed found himself standing alone at the pasture fence. The immediate crisis had passed, but the emotional weight of everything that had happened was just beginning to settle in. The mare approached him with none of her earlier fear, close enough that he could reach out and touch her neck if he chose to. Her dark eyes held something that looked almost like gratitude, an acknowledgement of the price he'd been willing to pay to keep her family safe. "You're going home," he told her quietly, "back to Colorado, to people who've been missing you for 8 months. Your foals too, they'll grow up safe, with proper care and all the love they deserve." The words should have brought satisfaction, but instead, Jed felt an unexpected hollow ache in his chest. These horses had given his life purpose and meaning again, had pulled him out of the grief that had threatened to consume him after Sarah's death. Saying goodbye would be harder than he'd anticipated. Agent Torres approached, her official demeanor softened by genuine sympathy. "The original owner in Colorado is driving down today to verify the identification and arrange transportation. She's been hoping for this moment since the day Moonlight Serenade disappeared." "That's good," Jed said, meaning it despite his own complicated feelings. "That's what matters, getting them back where they belong." Torres studied his expression with the perceptiveness of someone trained to read people. "Mr. Crow, I want you to know that what you did here, standing up to Cartwright, protecting these horses, helping us build this case, it made the difference. Without your courage, this operation would have continued indefinitely." As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jed felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in months. She would have been proud of what they'd accomplished here, proud of the stand they'd taken for creatures who couldn't defend themselves. The legal documents that had brought down Cartwright's empire were just pieces of paper, but they represented something larger, the idea that justice was possible, that ordinary people could make a difference when they found the courage to act. In his pasture, 3 horses grazed peacefully in the morning sunshine, safe at last from the cruelty that had defined too much of their lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult goodbyes, but today belonged to the simple miracle of a family reunited and evil finally brought to light. The new wooden sign caught the late afternoon sunlight as Jed hammered the final nail into the fence post, its fresh pine planks bearing the carefully carved words "Wild Horse Haven" in letters that spoke of permanence and purpose. 6 months had passed since the morning when federal agents had surrounded Ben Cartwright and his criminal enterprise collapsed like a house of cards. But the transformation of Jed's homestead was just beginning to reach its full potential. Where once there had been empty pastures stretching toward distant mountains, now 8 rescued horses grazed in contentment, each one a survivor of circumstances that should have destroyed them, each one proof that second chances were possible when someone cared enough to provide them. The operation had grown beyond anything Jed had originally imagined, but Martha insisted that Sarah would have approved of the expansion. She always said this place was meant for more than just the 2 of you. Martha reminded him, as she approached with a steaming cup of coffee and the day's mail. At 63, she'd taken on the role of unofficial coordinator for Wild Horse Haven, managing adoptions, scheduling veterinary visits, and somehow keeping track of enough paperwork to satisfy both state regulators and federal oversight agencies. Moonlight Serenade stood at the fence line, her coat gleaming with health and her eyes bright with the intelligence that had first caught Jed's attention in Cartwright's cruel pen. She'd returned from Colorado 3 months earlier, not as a rescued victim this time, but as the foundation mare for a breeding program designed to produce horses with her exceptional bloodlines and gentle temperament. The Hendersons called about adopting Thunder, Martha said, referring to a young gelding who'd been rescued from a neglect case in Nevada. They're driving down from Montana next week to meet him. Jed nodded, watching as Thunder played with 2 other young horses in the adjacent pasture. The healing that took place here went both ways. The horses learned to trust again, and the families who adopted them discovered the joy that came from offering love to creatures who had learned to expect cruelty. The foals, now yearlings with the gangly limbs and boundless energy of adolescent horses, had thrived beyond anyone's expectations. They bore their mother's intelligence and their father's sturdy build, creating a combination that would make them highly sought after as they matured. More importantly, they carried no emotional scars from their early abandonment, having been young enough to adapt completely to a world where humans meant safety rather than threat. Doc Peterson's truck appeared on the horizon, trailing its familiar cloud of dust as the 72-year-old veterinarian made his weekly rounds. He'd officially retired 6 months earlier, but retirement for Doc meant working only 6 days a week instead of 7, and spending more time with animals who were healing rather than dying. "How's our new arrival settling in?" he asked as he climbed out of his truck, medical bag in one hand and thermos of bourbon-spiked coffee in the other. The new arrival was a mare who'd been found abandoned in Arizona, thin, traumatized and pregnant, with a foal that would be born into better circumstances than its mother had known. She stood apart from the other horses, still learning that the fence around her was protection rather than imprisonment. "Slowly," Jed replied. "But she's eating well, and yesterday she let me brush her neck for almost 5 minutes before she got nervous." "That's progress. Trauma like hers doesn't heal overnight, but it does heal. You've proved that often enough." They walked through the facility together, checking on each animal and discussing treatment plans with the easy familiarity of men who'd found their calling later in life than they'd expected. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden hues, and the mountains in the distance looked like promises of space and freedom that no amount of human cruelty could diminish. Sheriff Morrison's patrol car pulled into the yard as they finished their rounds, its arrival announced by the barking of the blue heeler puppy that Martha had insisted Jed needed for company. Morrison climbed out with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily that law enforcement was a young person's profession. "Thought you'd want to know Cartwright was sentenced today," Morrison said without preamble. 23 years federal time, no possibility of parole for the first 12. Judge said it was one of the most extensive livestock theft operations he'd ever seen. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Jed found that his anger toward Cartwright had faded over the months. The man had been revealed as small and pathetic, driven by greed and ego to commit crimes that had ultimately destroyed his own life as thoroughly as they damaged his victims. "What about restitution for the owners who lost horses?" Martha asked, ever practical about the business side of justice. "That's going to take years to sort out. His assets are tied up in federal court, and there are claims from victims in 6 different states. But the important thing is that he can't hurt any more animals." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in the shades of orange and pink that had always reminded Jed of Sarah's presence, he found himself standing at the fence where Moonlight Serenade grazed with her newest foal, a perfect filly who carried the promise of generations yet to come. The mare lifted her head and nickered softly, a sound of recognition and contentment that spoke of trust finally restored. The wooden sign creaked gently in the evening breeze, its carved letters catching the last rays of sunlight. Wild Horse Haven had started as 3 words on a piece of pine, but it had become something larger, a symbol of the possibility that broken things could be made whole, that cruelty could be overcome by patience, and that love had the power to heal wounds that seemed too deep for mending. Martha appeared beside him, her presence as comforting as it had been on that first terrible morning when federal agents had surrounded his property, and everything hung in the balance. "Sarah would be proud," she said simply. "I think she'd be amazed," Jed replied. "We've gone from 1 rescued mare to 8 horses and a breeding program. Sometimes I wonder what we'll be in another 6 months. Whatever you're meant to be, that's how these things work. You start with 1 act of kindness and see where it leads." In the distance, Doc Peterson was loading his medical equipment into his truck, whistling an old tune that Jed remembered his father humming during evening chores. The sound carried clearly across the pastures, where horses grazed in peace, their scars hidden beneath healthy coats, and their fears soothed by the certain knowledge that they were finally safe. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jed made his final rounds of the day, checking water troughs and hay feeders, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his purpose in the simple act of providing sanctuary. Each horse he passed acknowledged his presence with soft sounds of greeting, not the desperate calls of animals in distress, but the contented murmurs of creatures who knew they were home. The old homestead that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with life and purpose. Sarah's dreams had taken a different form than either of them had imagined, but they had finally bloomed into the reality she'd always believed was possible, a place where the broken could heal, where the abandoned could find family, and where love triumphed over the casual cruelties that marked too much of the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses in need of rescue, new families looking for companions who had learned the value of second chances. But tonight, under a sky full of stars and surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses at peace, Jed Crow finally understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him all along, that some stories don't end with death, but transform into something larger and more beautiful than their original authors ever dared to imagine.